Well, now I feel incredibly welcome. I am going to tell you a quick little story that may make you throw me out. My granddaughter, right now, is celebrating with her special friends at her college because they just beat Minnesota. She's at Union College. So I told her that I would say that. She said, maybe you shouldn't. But you know, we love Union and we love Minnesota. I have one son who has lived here for years, and now I have a daughter, a granddaughter who is an enemy of you. So they kind of balance out in the end, don't they? I've been having a wonderful time here because I have been allowed to pontificate on and on and on and on. And who doesn't love that sometime in their lives, you know? It's better than having to pay for a therapist. I have a captive audience and you have to listen. So my topic is Breakthrough into Faerie, a meditation on the surprising rise of fairy tale related books, poetry, magazines, conventions, TV, movies, games, and ephemera. Or maybe not. I've been thinking about this topic nearly my entire life, beginning with my love of the Andrew Lang fairy color fairy books, to the surprising choice of me in 2012 to be the first woman to ever give the Andrew Lang lecture at St. Andrews University. It was a lecture series that has been going on since 1927, and I was the first woman. So as is my wont, I began my lecture by scolding them and talking about all the women they had missed along the way. In fact, in 1939, the year of my birth, a professor gave a lecture there on fairy stories, and his name was Professor J.R.R. Tolkien. So I was walking in pretty large boots. Along the way, from that 75 years ago when I was born, a number of fairy tale related books, short stories, poems, and essays have come out for me, and reviews and critiques and teaching, etc. I've told and retold a lot of folk and fairy tales, like Sleeping Beauty. I told it first as a picture book, just called, unsurprisingly, Sleeping Beauty. I wrote an easy reading satire called Sleeping Ugly, and a series of poems yet unpublished and unsold, maybe will never be published or sold, called Hedge, Briar, Rose, which is a kind of meditation on the characters in this story, and in a redacted novel from the point of view of the wicked fairy as a 13-year-old, the 13th child of the union between a fairy and a literate and book-loving elf. She's a child who literally stumbles into the sleep curse, and that's called the curse of the 13th Fae. In other words, my life, at least metaphorically, has been hedged about with fairy tales, and yet here I am, the true daughter of the 20th and 21st century, which means I am a left-wing, tree-hugging, politically active American Jew who is also a hard-working writer. And all of these things should be antithetical to the often hierarchical, medieval, occasionally anti-Semitic, oftentimes misogynistic, women in their proper places, carefully framed narratives that I have loved since childhood on. And that is why I have puzzled over folk and fairy stories for 3/4 of a century, and why I continue to find them protean in what they tell me about the human species, about tribal mentality, about creating the us against them narratives, about the staying power of storytelling, about biases, beliefs, and outdated priorities, as well as about my life. Now, in 2010, I don't know if you read the New York Times obsessively as I do, but in 2010, A.E. Stallings wrote this in the New York Times. The world, he said, from which fairy tales and folk tales emerged has largely vanished, and although it pleases us to think of these stark, simple, fantastic narratives as timeless, they aren't. Thanks to video games, computer graphics, and the general awfulness of everyday life, fantasies of all kinds have had a resurgence in the past few years, but the social realities on which the original fairy tales depend are almost incomprehensibly alien to 21st century sensibilities. They reek of feudalism, and the lessons they're supposed to teach our young don't have much force these days, unquote. Now, it'll come as no surprise to you that I disagree. And I'd like to think you're here today to hear my refutation of this argument, or at least to hear another side of it. Even if you had never heard what he had said before this moment, didn't come here because of that, you're going to hear it now anyway. And whether at the end you agree or disagree, I think that if you're ever faced with that argument, you will have more ammunition on either side. But since this is a lecture about stories, I feel impelled to tell you one. In fact, it's a story about telling the truth. Now, that story, The Old Lady in the Cave, has for provenance a mountaintop in Tennessee, which sounds rather like a bad country western song. I heard it there from storyteller Carol Birch, who got it from another storyteller who had nothing more to say about it. As an occasional oral storyteller who received this tale from another oral storyteller, I can swear to you this, that I have changed parts of it to make it better, a more cohesive story, to get at the heart of it faster, and I promise you that I have used more humor and more poetry than when it was offered to me. And further, I promise you that I have massaged it to make its last line zing. And that last line is possibly, probably, actually is the only legitimate bit of the tale that was handed down to me. That's what storytellers do. We smooth, change, decorate, shrink, or enlarge to engage our audiences. We bring the stories through us and into our own century, within the moral compass of our own cultures. We are the tellers that Sir Francis James Child warned us about. He was the one who gathered the child ballads, and he was really talking about the ballads, but it's true about stories as well. He said the three tellers of these tales are the blind beggar, the nursery maid, and the clerk. But more about that anon. Here is the story. The Old Lady and the Cave. Once there was a man who wanted to know truth. He spoke about it so often that at last his wife, who was a very smart woman, said, "You must go find truth, but first put everything in my name." So he did. And he went out on the road a beggar after truth. Now he looked for truth for a long, long time. He looked in the fishing villages where the fishermen spent the daylight hours in their boats and the fisher women baited 1,000 hooks each night. He looked for truth in the farming towns where men tended cattle and women milked cows, where the furrows were long and the days even longer. He looked for truth in the cities where the cobbled streets hurt his feet and the corbelled windows kept him from the wind, where the preachers spoke of times to come and the professors spoke of times gone by. He walked and he listened, he asked, and he took notes, but he could not find truth. And then, one day, up in the highest mountain, in a small cave, he found her. Truth. Truth was an old, old woman. Her hair was gray and lank and hanging down past her shoulders. Her skin was stretched tight like parchment across prominent bones, and her face was lined with the years. But when she signaled him into the cave, with a hand crabbed with time, her voice was low and lyrical and pure, and he knew that he had found truth at last. So he stayed with her. He stayed a year and a day, listening to all she had to teach. And when the year was up, he said to her, my Lady Truth, it is time for me to go back to my wife and my family. But before I go, is there any last thing that I can do for you?" Truth thought a minute, finger aside her nose, and then looked up, her milky eyes trained on him. "I know you must go now," she said, "but give me this promise." "Anything," he said, eager now to be away. "When you speak of me, tell them I am young and beautiful." Now, we all smile at that last line. Some of us even laugh out loud, thinking as I did when I first heard the version of the story on the mountaintop in Tennessee. Well, so much for truth. But by the time I got home and had given the story some thought, as one always must in preparing to tell it, to pass it on, I realized how smart and deep and true the story really was. Yes, the last line makes us laugh, but on reflection, it has told us something important. It has told us the truth. And what is the truth? That we remake our stories the way we remake our histories. That in order to keep folks interested in the old tales, we reclothe them, we repaint them, and make them beautiful all over again. Now, I often hear people new to fairies and folk tales or studying them for the first time ask the same question. Which is the first version of, say, Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty or other iconic Western canon folk tales, as if one can saw off a limb of the story and carbon date it? The truth is that much we say about any so-called folk story is a lie. First, we can make educated guesses about fairy tales and folk tales. We can cite their correspondences and differences. We can track places where they've been found. We can record the names and dates of the respondents who told the tale to the collector and where they had each individually borrowed it or been gifted the story by, or who they stole it from, or they may not even remember the circumstances. But in almost all the instances, we are counting on memory, which should rather be called re-memory, because most humans are storytellers, which is another word for liars. And most human memory is faulty. There have been many studies about how faulty human memory is. And of course, once we tell something that we say is historically accurate, not only do we continue to remember it that way, we have changed it. And then we remember the changes as if they are part of the history, i.e. the truth. And now it's a muddle. In fact, there is not one definitive oldest take of any specific story. Stories take long voyages to get to you. And like any inveterate traveler, they come home both changed and still somehow come home as themselves. They are made new again by a process of mouth-to-ear resuscitation. Second, the majority of stories go back to the mists of time, or the miasma that is tribal, or the mishigas that is transmission. And if you don't know the word mishigas, it's a Yiddish word. And if I tried to explain it to you, I would have to shoot you. In fact, when Sir Francis James Child edited the formidable English and Scottish ballads in 8 small volumes, when he wrote that the ballads were kept alive by those 3 different kinds of tellers, he meant this, that the blind beggar, the nursery maid, and the clerk are prototypical tellers who change the stories for their own particular reasons. The blind beggar does it to get a coin for his supper and a roof over his head, even if it's only a barn or a byre. He reshapes the story or ballad to his perceived notions of audience. If they don't like his rendition, he doesn't get paid. And he might get kicked or beaten for a bad performance as well. The nursery maid has her own notions of proper tales for her charges, notions that include hierarchies and social standings. So she chooses carefully when telling stories to her master's children. Besides, she doesn't want any of them waking up in the middle of the night screaming with bad dreams. Besides, therefore she both chooses and changes the tales to inculcate the proper moral lessons, as well as to keep both the children and the master of the house sweet. And as for the clerk, he writes the tales down, and in so doing, not only changes them for the audience of one, himself or herself, but also puts them in a finished form from which it is difficult ever to be changed thereafter, because somehow the tale on the printed page is more powerful than the whispered and half-remembered tale in the mouth. I suppose we could also add that stories also get changed by college professors who study the bits and pieces, rather like the blind man and the elephant. And stories are changed also by priests, rabbis, ministers, imams, all of whom are trying to set morals for their larger communities. And the king or queen or president in their bully pulpits who want to keep the populace firmly under their command. And the school teacher who has her own agenda, the grandmother who invents what she's long forgotten, the child in the classroom who's at the end of a rather elongated game of telephone, and the prophet leading his worshippers into their own kind of heaven or hell. In other words, everybody has a hand in changing these stories, not just my favorite punching bag, Walt Disney. And third, if you're still counting along with me and recognize that the rule of three is in itself deeply ingrained fairy tale trope, I remind you that I am not a trained folklorist, but a folklorist manqué. In other words, I just play one at the podium. What I am is a folk and fairy tale lover, and I have been so since I first discovered those wonderful Langcolor fairy books. Or rather, as I learned only a couple of years ago as I was working on my speech for the Lang lecture, it was Mrs. Lang, Andrew Lang's wife, and she's always known in the books as Mrs. Lang, along with several other women she called upon when a tale was in a language she didn't speak, who did all the choosing, the retelling, the translating of the stories in the books that bear her husband's name. He was a famous writer and folklorist. He was an early member of the British Folklore Society, so he was considered better for his name to be on the books than hers. Considered better by whom? I don't believe we know that. And fourth, which violates the rule of three, but is itself about the violation of what too many early folklorists considered sacred, not all folk tales begin with the folk tradition. Some are invented whole cloth by a single amazing storyteller. Hans Christian Andersen, Madame Le Prince de Beaumont, Oscar Wilde, Lawrence Houseman, Isaac Dinesen, to name a few of my favorites. These are stories that sound like and look like and smell like folk tales, but are a complete author fabrication. We call these art tales, but there is another name for them, and it's one that rankles. Now, a number of years ago, California folklorist Alan Dundas, quite well known in the folklore field, mentioned the word fake lore as one word, fake lore, to me rather witheringly on the phone as we were deep in negotiations about an essay of mine that he wanted to reprint in his Cinderella casebook, an essay called America's Cinderella. I took slight umbrage, being one of the people he was railing against, though he seemed oblivious to the slight. Yet at the same time, I realized that Dundas was placing me in very good company, because even the Brothers Grimm had doctored their stories to make them more acceptable to their ever-growing audiences. They did revised volumes after revised volumes that sharpened, toned down, rewrote, made changes in the stories. And then, a few years ago, it became common knowledge through researchers like Minneapolis professor Jack Sipes and others that some of the Grimm brothers' respondents were not even German peasants, but literate French Huguenots who had fled from persecution in their own country and, for the most part, had learned their stories from books. Now, Dundas wrote about the term folklore in an article called, you're going to love this title, Nationalistic Inferiority Complexes in the Fabrication of Folklore, a Reconsideration of Ossian, the Kinder- und Hausmärchen, the Kalevala, and Paul Bunyan. I won't read it again. It was boring enough the first time. Though he was really following in the footsteps of the great folklorist Richard M. Dawson, who coined that oh-so-clever bit of punditry, which, as Dundas put it, served Dawson in his lifelong battle to promote the scientific study of folklore and to attack fake folklore. Fake folklore. That battle began with Dawson's barrage called Folklore, a piece published in 1950 in the American Mercury, which was a popularizing magazine. And then he later wrote a longer work about folklore, published in 1976, which was a truly nasty part of a debate critique review of author James Stevens, who had written a book on Paul Bunyan. Now, you may or may not know it, Paul Bunyan being the great, Midwestern folk hero, but he was, like the Jolly Green Giant years later, or Smokey the Bear, not a folklore borrowing at all, but a character created by a marketing department. So what? Bunyan later became part of folklore, and new stories were told about him and written about him. And even more of Stevens' book, as well as taking side swipes, then Dawson took even more swipes at Stevens' books, as well as side swipes at the work of Ben Botkin, basically calling both of them purveyors of folklore, who were creating, and this is a quote, a synthetic product claiming to be authentic oral tradition, but were actually tailored for mass edification. Actually, they were invented by the marketing department. Who believes the marketing department, of anything? Well, what I believe is that in the beginning, both Dawson and Dundas merely meant the word to mean, in Dawson's definition, a presentation of spurious and synthetic writings under the claim they are genuine folklore. And by genuine, Dawson meant folklore collected in the field. It's rather narrow, because folklore collecting hadn't been that old. But eventually that turned into a larger, more complicated argument that was unsustainable, because Dawson also railed against the treasuries, Paul Bunyan books, and children's story collections. But the most serious charge was where he said that the authors, the editors, and the publishers had knowingly and willingly colluded in misleading and gulling the public. I wish I could find a publishing company that had that much sense, actually. I don't like the Dundas-Dawson dyad, and I'm delighted it's no longer current among modern folklorists who see the field in larger terms. Though every once in a while, and in fact fairly recently, I come upon vestiges of that kind of thinking. However, what I believe is that Dundas and Dawson were getting at something that had more to do with the understandable perception that an art tale carries with it an assumption or acknowledgement of personal history. I think we can all agree about that. When I write a story, even in the folk mode, it will come out of my history, my own biography, my own bones and blood. Just like any writing I do, it will mirror me, my community, where I live, where I work, whom I love. It will be a reflection of my moral stance in the universe as a 20th, 21st century woman in America. How could it not? It will tell my readers and me of my concerns, of where I am, where I stand. But it's important for all of us to understand that even fairy tales that we so often claim are universal and ageless do carry thumbprints of their own time. Now, a few years ago, I attended a fairy tale conference at Princeton. I must tell you, it was a very interesting conference for many reasons, but one of them was that no one told a story. There were storytellers in the audience, There were book writers in the audience. There were academics in the audience. There were speakers galore. And no one told a story anytime during the conference. There were 5 of us sitting in a row, all in the publishing world and the storytelling world, and we're going. I said, should we get up there and tell stories? And then none of us had the gall to get up and interrupt and say, excuse me, it's time for a story. But we all felt that way. So I attended this fairy tale conference where one of the speakers, who was an international lawyer, showed us how fairy tale punishments in classic European fairy tales could be explained explicitly in terms of the community's mores and laws from that era, and where each story was thought to have originated. He cited the witch shoved into the oven in Hansel and Gretel, and the wicked queen forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes, both of which mirrored prevailing laws about the burning of witches. Made metaphoric in the story, but still, those witches are burned at the end. Now, that our stories mirror our times and reflect prevalent prejudices and class hatreds shouldn't surprise us. The tellers, retellers, as well as originators of our tales don't live in a vacuum, but in specific communities, some small and tribal, some more national in scope, some more international in scope. Our stories are part of our tribal mentality, even for those who like to think of our tribe as global. We can try to escape small-mindedness, prejudice, hatred, but the verdict of future historians, scholars, and readers will task us for our biases and our judgments and our laws. So let me give you 2 interesting, I think, fairy tale examples. I want you to think about Puss in Boots, with a troll or dragon. It depends which, it's told sometimes with a troll, sometimes with a dragon, who has lived many years as the king's neighbor with never a harsh word between them, or at least none that we're made aware of in the story. The troll dragon is an employer of the local peasantry, and none of them seem to curse his name. Indeed, his fields are well tended, his people well looked after, as far as we can tell from the story. Now along comes Puss, who decides to help out his young master to a large slice of the noble pie. Perhaps like Mr. Romney in Bain Capital, he disposes of the troll dragon and takes over the family business. And we all applaud Puss's ingenuity and his courage, not because the troll dragon has been demonstrably wicked or evil. After all, unlike some of his cousins, he hasn't been devouring the local gentry. But he is fair game for Puss simply because he is the other. He is the troll dragon. In fairy tale terms, he is a red shirt. He is disposable. He marches on, we kill him, he's taken off. Nobody mourns him, and everyone considers trickster Puss a genius. He's one of us. The troll dragon is one of them. It never gets old. Now I want you to think about Rumpelstiltskin. A miller tells the king's messenger his daughter can spin straw into gold. He lies, and he knows he is lying. His daughter is complicitous in the lie. She knows he is lying, and now she's lying. The king wants the girl because he wants the gold. If she doesn't produce the gold, he'll kill her. If she does produce the gold, he'll marry her, the perfect wife, because she'll come with an ongoing dowry. Kings love ongoing dowries. So he locks the girl into a room in a tower, and she has till dawn to do the deed, to prove she's worthy to be married to the king, worthy to live another day, worthy to keep supplying the kingdom with gold. Do we like any of these people? Not really. They're liars, greedy guts, narcissists, all. But wait. The miller's daughter sits weeping by a spinning wheel in the small room surrounded by piles and piles of straw, certain that in the morning she's going to die because she knows that spinning straw into gold is well above her pay grade. And because her father lied. All right, in comes a little man, an odd little man. Not at all like the girl, who after all is unsurprisingly very beautiful. We are in a fairy tale, remember. Heroines are always beautiful here. The little man has a big nose, and an unpronounceable name. And he lives outside the walls of a city. He tells the miller's daughter that he can save her because he can do what she is incapable of, supplying the king with the gold he desires. In return, unthinking, desperate, she offers him her mother's wedding ring on the first night. On the second night, she offers him a locket. And on the third, with nothing more to give him, she promises her firstborn child, though it will be years, a lifetime perhaps, before she can do what she promises. She began this story complicitous in a lie, and now she's made a promise she has no intention of keeping. I'm going to give her a little wiggle room here. I admit if she's dead in the morning, the promise of the child will be moot. But no, she doesn't ask the little man what he wants the child for. For her, it's simply a good bargaining chip. But you know what? I'm not liking her more because of this. I'm liking her less. Then the little man sits down at the spinning wheel, and he does what he promises. He did not lie. He can do the miraculous as if it's an everyday event, and for him it is, because it's his job. It's the only job he has, the only one he's allowed in the kingdom, actually. And he also keeps none of the gold. Why should he? He knows how to make more. Now, who does this remind you of, this ugly little man with his large nose, his foreign unpronounceable name, this little ugly mannequin who can supply the kingdom's gold, though he is not allowed to live within the kingdom's walls, but only somewhere out there away from the real true folk, somewhere out of sight? And why is it the new queen can renege on her promise when she actually gives birth to the child? Could it be because that we have no actual evidence of it within the story, only hints which an early audience would have gotten, you know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, because this little man wants her child for some unspeakable blood right? Certainly not too big a leap to realize that Rumpelstiltskin in this story is a stand-in for the Jews, who were not welcomed into the royal walled city, but who had to live outside of their own small, unprotected communities, and who were only allowed to be money changers. That was their only job. Interesting to note, in case you're thinking I'm reading too much into this, that in the English version of the story, called Tom Tit Tot, the little man is a black imp. And in a variant in Eastern Europe, he is a gypsy. That trio of perfect medieval victims, Jew, black, gypsy. Still perfect victims, one might add, well into the middle of the 21st century, perhaps beyond. We still tell the story. Unthinkingly, we tell it. We take the queen's side. We cheer her on without looking any deeper into the story, calling it just a fairy tale. But I believe it has the imprints of a deeper, darker story at its core. And of course, not all of our most beloved stories wear well under this kind of scrutiny. I want you to think about the ending of Snow White. You remember the happy ever after when one of the servants carrying the glass coffin stumbles and the apple stuck in Snow White's throat gets dislodged, and she wakes up from her poison-induced death-like sleep. You remember that, right? Wait a minute, let's back up a minute. What do we really think about a prince who buys the body of a young woman to take back to his palace in a glass casket? Yes, careless readers. In the earlier versions, he purchases the girl in the box from the dwarfs. Purchases. What does he plan to do with her? Display her on his coffee table as a conversation piece? Donate her to his church as a miracle to be admired when she doesn't corrupt like an ordinary corpse? Take her into the bed. No, best not go there. And a modern reader also has to ask herself, will the prince love her as much when she's awake and talking to him, arguing with him, pointing out where he's made a mistake, asking him to take out the trash? Or does he prefer her in her death trance, silently perfect? Or what do you do when you discover that in an earlier version of Sleeping Beauty, the prince falls in love with her, can't wake her as she sleeps, and 9 months later, she bears twins? What was that prince thinking? One of whom, of these twins, one of whom suckles on her finger, dislodges the splinter of the spindle beneath her nail and breaks the enchantment, so she wakes up. You know, stories are not just flat objects, not just cultural artifacts. They are not just beautiful dead women in glass coffins that we purchase to keep on our bookshelves. They live and breathe and talk back to us. They comment on their own times and make us re-examine our own. They still have much to tell us. It may not be what they thought they were telling us, but it's what they're telling us now. Okay, I want you to take a minute to think about how often the best of authored fairy tales, art fairy tales, fake lore stories, have already moved back into the folk corner, some even becoming canon. And there they hide for any number of years until they emerge as, ta-ta, folk tales. I want you to think about Goldilocks, originally called Silverlocks, which was written by British poet Robert Southey, or The Ugly Duckling and The Little Mermaid, both authored by Hans Christian Andersen, or Beauty and the Beast by Madame Leprince de Beaumont, and Aladdin in the compendium of stories called 1001 Nights, which does boast many legitimate folk tales. But Aladdin was authored by someone unknown, but who is clearly in the mode of exoticizing the Far East. These all began as authored tales, not folk stories. And I know that more recently, several of my own creations, Grayling and Sleeping Ugly and Once a Good Man and The Girl Who Cried Flowers, have taken such journeys. They went into the brains and hearts and souls of gifted storytellers who are now telling them at storytelling conferences and olios and storytelling performances. And those stories, badly remembered, go out with the audience where they tell and retell the stories, and now they have become folk stories. And it also may interest you to know that I've watched Tommy DePaola's Strega Nona, among dozens and dozens of other authored stories, make that same trick with thanks to librarians and that new generation of storytellers. And that Virginia Haviland, who was the late grande dame of the American Library of Congress's children's section, believed that Strega Nona was the, quote, lost Italian version of the mill that ground salt at the bottom of the sea, and she came tripping across the marble floor of the Library of Congress to embrace DePaola, telling him so with great enthusiasm, though he laughingly tells this story on himself. So he said, "I made Strega Nona up and said it in Italy because I'm Italian." Dear Virginia Haviland, she refused to believe him, and it was sort of a jolly, half-joking, long-running argument between them till the day she died. And that's what Dawson forgot, or for the sake of his argument, ignored. And when Dundas picked up that particular torch, he ignored it as well. These stories travel. They travel in and out of the oral tradition, in and out of the written tradition, and back again. We find them in hieroglyphs and on parchment scrolls hidden away in caves, in day books and jest books. We find them in the mouths of French Huguenots, rabbinical midrashim, Christian and Buddhist and Muslim parables. We find them around campfires and hearth fires and on the decks of long sea voyages and in foxholes in the middle of a war. We find those same stories going in and out, mouth to ear, finger to page. And now they are in movies and television and in other kinds of phosphor, where they're taking on a new and very wild life, which seems to multiply the readings and the misreadings by the billionfold. And as these stories are passed along over and over and over again, it becomes less and less clear where they started, or if they shall ever end. Now, I am not a person of medieval heritage who has visions of angels coming down to earth. But in fact, several months ago, I had a vision, an audio and visual vision, and I'm not crazy. It was about a year ago after Steve Jobs died. Now I am not, I remind you, a martyr, and I'm not Joan of Arc. But I saw this. I heard two men conversing in a heavenly pub. One was Steve Jobs, and the other was an older man with a Duck Dynasty beard, a long black gown topped with a stiff white collar, and a funny hat on his head. And I recognized him the moment he spoke with his heavy German accent. It was Johannes Gutenberg. The two men were talking about delivery of story. Not story itself, because they both understood its importance to human beings. Humans are the storytelling animal, after all. But they were talking about how the delivery of story changes from mouth to ear, from the Gutenberg Bible set in movable type to the e-books of today, the apps, the high-def machines. That's what they were arguing about. That's what they were talking about. That's what they were discussing. All storytelling uses memory, or rememory for those of us whose grasp of the past is exceeded by the need to embellish and decorate, deepen, widen, and otherwise change what is actual into the fantastic, the new, and the true. But one can still see the older bones beneath that parchment skin, behind the newly plumped lips and the scrim of makeup, the scrolling of the e-book, the singing of the apps, the eyes of truth, the storyteller, are still old and wise. Tell them I am young and beautiful. That's every storyteller's creed. But what happens when the storyteller moves out of the mouth, off the pages, and onto the screen, or into the apps, or songs, or advertising campaigns? Is that serving a different audience and a different truth? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, the audience will be larger, wider, cross more boundaries than a single storyteller performing his tale to a tribe, of course. But so did the Grimm stories and the Andersen stories. Beauty and the Beast took the world by storm in all sorts of media. They have left the intimacy of tribes to cross borders and boundaries. We've found variants of these kinds of tales in the Iroquois longhouses, in the igloos of the Inuit, in the kraals of South Africa, in the turreted houses of the Middle East. They have followed slave routes and wars, traveled to ports frequented by sailors, and the doss houses visited by drunks. They have gone with voyageurs and the Vikings, and I don't mean the Minnesota Vikings, but that too maybe, the Huns and the Tartars, the Jewish traders along the Silk Roads. Where there is a man and a woman and a child, there will be a tale. It is no wonder that the end of the word history is the word story. But taking the story out of the mouth and putting it onto the page was a huge change. Putting it down in runes and hieroglyphs on the walls of caves, that's where the stories begin to set, to be put in sort of a concrete, in both senses of the word. They become immovable, they become historical. Now they seem to have a kind of heft that they didn't have before. We can revisit that particular tale again and again without need of the intermediary of the teller. The tale will always be the same, comfortably, knowably, repeatedly the same. Should we forget part of it? As I do more and more as I get older, there's a story right in front of me. Except, of course, when we revisit it at different ages, we ask different questions of the story. At which point commentaries, pilpul, midrashim, psychoanalytics enter the story, stirred about like a big soup pot. Folklore start making variant comparisons. English teachers stick their 2 cents in. Comp-lit scholars dive in. Even the youngest and smallest of the listeners whines, "That's not the way I heard the story." I did that with Snow White. As a child, I lived in New York City, where my little brother and I had been warned over and over and over again, never open the apartment door to strangers. Check them out through the peephole. And being a child who colored within the lines for way longer than my contemporaries and was an early and outspoken moralist, I felt strongly that when, despite the warnings from the dwarfs not to let strangers in the house, you know, dwarfs are in that book small stand-ins for parents, Snow White opens the door to the witch, and who is stranger than a witch, and she got what she deserved. That's what I thought as a 7-year-old. She got what she deserved. I was even slightly disappointed when she was rescued, because she certainly didn't deserve to be rescued. Now, some years later in my early writing life, a proto-feminist, I recognized the buying the dead girl in her coffin business was an icky, slippery slope, which no one else was talking about. And when I did start talking about it in papers and classrooms and talks, the response was always, "Ew, now you've spoiled that story for me." But even later, when my beautiful teenage daughter was acting like a beautiful teenage daughter who had a propensity for bad boys, and I was preparing a lecture on folk and fairy tales for the children's literature class that I taught at Smith College, I realized with a shock that there was nothing I would have liked better than to stick her in a glass casket until the right college acceptance or the right prince came along. Those stories, honed by centuries, millennia of tongue polishing, carry with them the thoughts, feelings, morals of not only the originating time, but all the cultures through which they have passed since then. As I said at the beginning, they are protean, rich in meanings. They are our cultural respiration. And now we have this new-ish phenomenon that I mentioned at the beginning, redaction. In fairy tale terms, it means reseeding the old stories from different points of view, different emphasis, pulling out the recognizable tropes, reworking them into retellings in a new, different, and occasionally very surprising ways. This phenomenon was in poetry mostly and occasional storybooks, and quite underground, but is now so overground that we groan when another redaction comes along. The whole thing is a cultural phenomenon, is maybe less than 100 years old, but with the hunger for content that new purveyors of story have. And I'm talking about movies, TV, advertisers, pop culture, video games, all fueled by big money, unlike publishing, which is dying on the vine. We are into a groundswell of redacted retellings. I mean, how many Snow Whites have you seen on the big screen and the little screen lately? Snow White is hardly even seen as a child anymore, and less than vital part as an adult, while the top names in those movies are older actresses who are chewing every bit of scenery available as the evil queen. And I mean every bit of, if people were standing their way, they get chewed too. So how many TV fairy tale shows are there in which characters from various, almost always grim stories, interact? Or Castle solving a series of look-alike fairy tale murders, or video games starring a fairy tale-ish superhero character, or ads in which the Wolf and Little Red or Sleeping Beauty or Rapunzel-like characters are selling clothing or makeup or cars. I mean, it's everywhere. Not only Disney is reclothing and retelling fairy tales at an alarming rate, but other animators are too. I have to tell you that I do like a couple. My favorite are Tangled and Brave. My least favorite, Beauty and the Beast, which in my daughter's fabulous analysis is a handbook for wife batterers. Let's be very, very quiet because we don't want Beast to wake up. The question is not why it's happening, but why now? The question is not how it's happening, but how often. The question is not who, but who does not. And I leave all those questions for you, especially you graduate students where there is probably a master thesis and a doctoral dissertation to be mined here. My job is almost done. I want to leave you with a series of poems. I am writing a series of poems about Sleeping Beauty, and I've chosen 3 of them for 3 reasons as well. First, though some of them have sold individually to magazines, the book has not been sold yet and may never be. So I want someone to hear them. Second, because I think you can see how a single author obsessed with a fairy tale can see, reinterpret, bring into a specific century of creation a new way of apprehending a particular tale. And third, it leads into a short mention of poetry, because I haven't spoken yet about that genre, where in my own sense of wonder and wondering, I have read some of the most spectacular redactions of fairy tales to date. And the poems resonate for me in an entirely perfect and personal way, and they bring their own changes in my fairy tale life. So here are my 3, I think it's 3 stories. And I guess last, because I think that these poems and this whole speech, Chase speech, and thanks ever so much for having me for the Chase speech, and thanks for everybody who makes the Chase speech possible. It's fun to go back and revisit these things. So I think this whole speech is refuting what A.A. Stallings wrote about how little fairy tales and folk stories have to do with our lives today. So this is punctuation at the end of my refutation. The first poem is called Doorway. There is a knob of oak or ceramic, if you must, a latch of bronze, never iron, for it would burn a fairy hand, a golden key hidden behind the ivy or under the gnome-shaped rock. Grasp it firmly, or it will bite. Keys hate the sweaty palm, the half attempt at poking through the waiting keyhole, those heartless, artless tries. Then the magic words begin. Once, and the door itself trembles. Upon, there is a puff of white smoke. Take a breath, for you will need it. Time, which is all time and no time at all. There is a click of anticipation. The door sighs open, and all of the world awaits within. The second one is called Riding the Goose, Riding the Swan. Where do you think all those heroes, riding the goose, riding the swan in tights, cocked hats, swords in hand, were heading towards anyway? If you check happy ending, you haven't a clue. They're chasing wonder, knowing the unknown. Not marriage to king, queen, not making love to the princess awake or asleep, not a cross or a crown or the taking of a town, but the real ever after the book is closed. What they seek doesn't finish when the clock strikes 1 or end with a ball, feast, test, first kiss, but when they crack open the common world like a walnut struck with a hammer first thing on Christmas morning. And the last one is called The Old Fairy at the Christening. No, I said, no, but they dragged me out anyway, all wrinkles and long dugs. I scared the cats, my nails cracked as if they were the ends of pork too long in the fire, my hair brittle and startled, eyes full of rheum, and the beginnings of a second cataract. Old age, I told them, needs invisibility, but they hauled me to the baby's party without listening to my complaints. So of course, I gave them the full organ recital. What still works, what drips, what aches, what falls off at inconvenient moments, like toenails or clots of hair, like curses. Unlikely I will be invited to the next. Thank you.